Hello, I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question. In this half-hour podcast series from the Centre for Independent Studies, we explore questions and challenges to liberalism today. I'm very pleased that my guest today is Sabine Beppler-Spahl. Sabine is chair of the German liberal think tank, Freiblickinstitut, or Free Vision Institute, and she joins me from Berlin. Sabine, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Can I ask you, what is the view of the Freiblickinstitut Institute on what liberalism is?
Well, we adhere to the kind of classic, actually Anglo-Saxon idea of liberalism, which relates right back to the 17th century. So I believe that the core pillars of liberalism are freedom and tolerance, and you can't have one without the other. So freedom being the classic freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, people having the right to live and their religion. And tolerance, of course, going back to the often attributed to Voltaire, the sentence attributed to Voltaire, saying, I disagree with you deeply, but I will defend to my death your right to say what you want to say. So that's really our notion of liberalism. And we think that no free society, no thriving society can live without these basic pillars.
That's a definition I think would be very familiar to us here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Can I ask, have you always been a believer or a supporter of this vision, or have you changed your mind in life to come to support it?
Well, I think in the past years, the idea of free speech has become more and more important to me. So I realized how crucial it is as things became more shaken up in German politics. So if you remember the early days in the Cold War, the world seemed to be much more kind of, stable, and you had your sort of a line of thought. So I come from a very social democratic family, and it was more the kind of social democratic idea. And then you had the end of the Cold War, the wall came down, and suddenly you started having to challenge a lot of the beliefs you might have had in the past. We were also confronted with new ideas, people coming from Eastern Europe and bringing in new ideas of freedom and liberalism themselves. So this was kind of something which got us thinking. We also felt in the last years the realms of debates narrowing down more and more through certain, for example, we had the migration crisis in 2015, which really shook up German society quite a bit. And there were very, very suddenly, a very harsh climate of debate. People saying, whenever you had a critical voice about immigration, you were then suddenly allocated to the right wing. And so these were kind of things which got me thinking and saying, well, we need a much broader basis of debate. We need much more, much more tolerance, really, on what people are saying, listening to what people are saying. And this is why we founded our institute, saying that's our basic aim, is to get the debate going, to stop accusing each other of being right wing or left wing, and just kind of listening and trying to move further towards, what do we really believe, and where should we go as a society?
So just like Greg Lindsay founded the Centre for Independent Studies way back in the 1970s, you decided to do something about this problem and not just think about it, and found your institute.
Yes.
What do you do? I just briefly, what is the work of the institute?
Well, we, for example, in Berlin, we have what we call our Berlin Salons once a month. We have debates on topics, important issues. We've been talking a lot, obviously, about COVID these last months and years. We've also talked about women's liberation issues. We have a big discussion in Germany at the moment about gender language. We spoke briefly just before this podcast about German. So German is a language which has sexualized nouns. Yeah, so we have male nouns, female nouns, and there is a huge debate at the moment in Germany about non-discrimination, which has affected our language. So there is this idea that in the past, when you wanted to talk about male and female, you would use the male form, saying it included everything. And that led to some injustices, to be fair. But the way things are going, it's now become a requirement for all public radio stations to constantly use the female form whenever they're speaking, and actually even changing words from in a very sort of grammatically strange way. It's like Life of Brian, I don't know if you know that scene when they're sitting and talking.
Yes, I do. And
they say, "Oh yes, and women," and it's and it really makes radio programs awkward and strange. And surveys after surveys show that the majority of the Germans really don't want this, don't agree with this. So all these kind of issues which have come up in the last years we've been talking about.
When I studied German at high school many years ago, I was taught that the D and der and D were not sexual, but merely gender. They weren't meant to be referring to gender. In fact, am I right? In German, the word for the little das Mädchen, which is neuter for the young woman, which
yes.
We'll come back to this. I want to come back to that in a moment. I'm wondering, in German history, you talked about you yourself picking up some of the Anglo-Saxon world. Is there a tradition of liberalism? And I'm just thinking then, my guess is the 1848 failed revolution a moment when liberalism had its day and then was overcome by other forces? Would that be fair?
Yes, I think that would be fair. That is a very tragic moment, really. And the way it's interpreted is that it was the bourgeoisie, the rising bourgeoisie with liberal ideas, which then somehow gave up, lost the struggle, lost the fight, and opted later for unity against freedom. So you had German reunification in 1871.
The second empire. Yes,
that's right, and it was a reunification, or not a reunification, a unification following a war, a very kind of militaristic situation. A unification from above by Bismarck rather than from below the people. So all this affected German history, and it's. And if you look at, actually, I get quite sentimental about German history, because whenever I read about it, I always think, oh my goodness, it could have gone this way, but it went this way. So always very, very close.
Sabine, am I not right that the flag of the German Republic is the flag of the 1848 revolution?
Yes.
Which means
that's right.
Which must have been a conscious decision by I guess it would have been the Federal Republic in the early 50s to identify with the 1848 liberal revolution, even if it failed.
Yes, that's right. And it is something German politics does go back to, although it's very interesting because just a couple of years ago, we had the anniversary of the founding of the German Reich, German unification, and it just passed by, and nobody really kind of, it was just
this is the 1871.
Think about it.
There you are. Well, the Versailles Hall of Mirrors is very, very expensive to hire these days, I'm sure.
This is the thing, you see, Germans don't like to think too much about their history. It's one of the problems is that you say, well, it's all so messy, it's all so terrible, but it does mean that you also forget the kind of positive things in German history, the kind of chances Germany had, which you might pick up and build on, but that's not really what's done.
Am I also right? There was a flowering of liberal, very almost notorious flowering of liberal ideas and thoughts after the Great War. I mean, it was crushed by the coming of National Socialism, but there was a time, I believe, when Berlin was some of the most free places in Europe as a reaction to the authoritarianism of the Wilhelmite Empire.
Yes. I mean, this was, that was November 1918, and you had people on the streets and saying, we want democracy. That's really what it was. It was a demand for radical democracy. It's often seen or described as a demand for communism, which really it wasn't. If you go back to the time, it was radical democracy, getting rid of the monarchy. It wasn't actually clear in the first days after the war whether the monarchy would really be, whether the king would abdicate, but he had to. Pressure was so strong.
Yes.
And it's another one of these tragic moments of German history, because a lot of that kind of democratic sentiment, which was really there, wasn't used. So it was people tried to rechannel it, and I would argue that now you have to really go back to history. I'm actually trying to write a book in that period at the moment, so it's quite interesting. But I would argue that it was the Social Democrats who played a negative role in undermining and suppressing some of that very kind of radical democratic sentiment, and by aligning themselves with the old military, with some of the old military forces. In
fact, I was thinking of, there's a very famous German who gave us a form of government which has caused untold suffering in the world. I'm thinking of Karl Marx, who wrote as a reaction to the 1848 failure. Has there been I mean, this is probably a silly question, but has there been a kind of, within German history, a tendency towards socialism or a love of socialism in various forms that only after the Second World War has it finally been, well, even then still, Social Democrats do very well in Germany, don't they? Is there some reason why Germans are not as individualistic as, say, Anglo-Saxons, and therefore think much more of the community, therefore of more corporatist, more communitarian ways of running society?
Maybe, in the sense that, I mean, the Anglo-Saxon, talking about Britain, which was, of course, the country of the Industrial Revolution, which happened much, much earlier. So Germany was a bit, in a funny way, Germany was a bit like China in the late 19th century, copying everything from Britain. So most of, you would have industrialists going to Britain, and Engels was one of them, famous, looking at how Britain doing things, and you had a different type of society. I think probably it's also true that the German trade union movement and the German, as you say, the Social Democratic Party was probably much stronger, which would have brought in this communitarian sentiment. So you had the Social Democrats before the First World War becoming the strongest party in Germany. So that would have made a difference to the kind of debates you had in the country.
And it was Bismarck who brought in what I think are good reform, but nonetheless are welfare state reforms like the age pension. Am I not right?
That's as a response to the pressure he was under, but he also had the anti-socialist laws. We shouldn't forget that.
Oh,
so
I see. Okay.
So it was a very, very repressive time, and I just read in a little history book that, for example, there was an attempt when the king was shot. It was a woman was sentenced to prison for saying, well, he's a very wealthy man, he can have good doctors treating him, and she got like 9 months prison for that.
Oh dear.
It was a very, very kind of repressive. Free speech was never very strong in Germany, and only became an issue actually, as you said, after the First World War, after the Great War, and the kind of revolutionary sentiments around that time.
Yes. So do you in your institute, your Free Vision Institute, are you lone voice? Are you a lone voice crying in the wilderness, or are you part of a growing movement in Germany? I guess it probably depends on day to day, does it? Which day I ask you.
No, I think there's been. We're not. It would be too much to say that we're a lone voice. There are discussion groups all over the country, and I would say there is a thriving debating culture in Germany, so we've been there are people, the issue of cancel culture, for example. So that's something we picked up very, very early, saying we have a problem here. We do have, in fact, a growing problem of people who lose their jobs or their positions, or get kicked out of public meetings, de-invited after having fallen out of grace for some reason. So we were one of the first to kind of touch or talk about that problem. But there is a growing discussion about it in Germany, and I think there is a growing sort of recognition that something has gone wrong, something has gone amiss.
I noticed you've printed a book on cancel culture. I'll try and pronounce it because it's a very interesting title. It's called Cancelkultur und Meinungsfreiheit, which means free speech in German, but the cancel culture language is in English.
Yes.
Is there not a German word?
And it is a phenomenon which has come from Britain. Or from America.
And America, I think, in my view, America much more than Britain, actually. Is
America.
Is there a German word for cancel culture, or is the concept an import from...
No, we use the Anglicism. And I think it's probably... So there's been censorship in Germany, I think, always. I don't think German societies ever existed without censorship. And part of that goes back, the censorship we have now goes back to the Second World War and the kind of anti-fascist sentiment, saying we must never again have a situation like this. So when Germany was, refounded after the Second World War, there were a lot of kind of checks and balances put into the German constitution, which limit the debate. So that's something Germans grew up with and Germans know quite well. But cancel culture is a little bit different because it doesn't actually come from the state so much. It's not a law in that sense. It's more a kind of cultural thing. So it's certain pressure groups, journalists who get overexcited about people voicing an unpleasant opinion and then calling on them to be cancelled. And that's a sort of different matter. And that's why we use the English term cancel culture, because it's become like, it's clearer that that's what we're talking about. It's nothing official.
That's very interesting. In fact, I'm just thinking, poor Germany, you had censorship during the Second Empire.
Yes.
You had some freedom possibly in the early days of the Weimar. You had massive censorship in the National Socialist era. And now, once that's over, you have anti-fascist censorship in the founding of the Federal Republic. And every time, someone's always trying to shut people up to do them good. That's why I say so.
Yes, it's to protect people from themselves. And the funny thing is that you mentioned it was anti-fascist censorship. But actually, so there was a law against radicalism enshrined in the German constitution. And the first time it was applied was actually against the Communist Party. It was made illegal in the 1950s for communist propaganda. So it's very, very flexible. But it does speak to a deep mistrust of people, saying we cannot trust people.
Well, can I push back on that for a moment? Maybe if you are a German in the Federal Republic and you've seen your history and you hear and you know that a lot of people still hold radical ideas, that just because the war was lost didn't mean people changed their mind about things, and against them is other radicals of the communists, left and right. Was there not a case, do you think, in the early days for preventing propaganda by either unreformed Nazis or communists? Or do you think that freedom ought to always trump if the argument?
I would say
really,
yes. As a true liberal in that front, I would say freedom always trumps. Should be the most important principle, because you cannot have this principle while at the same time censoring thought. I mean, I understand that people were after the war a bit worried, but on the other hand, Nazism had discredited itself completely.
Yes.
It was clear. I mean, Germany was in rubbles, and I think that if there were still right-wing sentiments, they should have been brought out into the open, and they were brought out into the open and challenged. And that was the whole problem, that you couldn't challenge them in that time, in that fascist era, because we have to remember that the Nazis came to power and immediately suppressed whatever liberalism there would have been, free parties. People had to go in hiding almost like from day one of the fascist takeover. So there were elections after 1933. They were far from free elections and held under massive repression.
So there's a worry. Yes, keep going. Finish your point, please, Sabine.
No, it's fine.
I'm sorry.
No.
I was saying, so there's a way in which, for a country like England, Britain, I should say, and the United States, there are issues here, real big issues about freedom and being suppressed, cancel culture and so forth. But they're countries with a long tradition of open debate, notwithstanding these problems, and maybe therefore take it for granted. For a German, this is a precious commodity, which has been such a rare commodity that perhaps you're more enthusiastic about it because you've seen for so many years the suppression of thinking, of free speech, in a way that others have taken for granted. Am I right?
I wouldn't generalize it. I don't think so. So I'm very Anglophile, and I get a lot of my ideas, I have to say, from Britain. And I follow the British press very closely. I'm a great admirer of the British debating culture, and as you said, the free speech culture. I don't think it is as entrenched in Germany. I think that Germans have a very, they've become so used to this idea of speech being regulated and needing an institution, an authority to kind of guarantee this whole thing. So we have,
right.
Germany is probably one of so we have a constitutional court. That's another thing, and in fact, in the last years, we've had this very worrying development of political debates, rather than being carried through and brought to some kind of conclusion. They've been immediately pushed onto the constitutional court with asking judges then to make a judgment on which opinion is right and which opinion is wrong.
Can you give me impression? Can you give an example? That seems to me quite astounding. Can you give me examples?
It is astounding and very dangerous. Well, we've had it again and again. We had it in the during the COVID period. So we had all demonstrations were forbidden, and rather than sort of having a debate on whether this is, which was completely the wrong thing to do, I think, but it was always immediately then brought to the courts and left to the courts to decide on how to deal with this virus and the restrictions. But we've had that on the on the Euro level, the EU level, whenever there were sort of problems arising through the common currency or through within the EU, they've always been discussed in court. They have been discussed in society, but it's always been sort of the court which had the last word as to whether a certain financial policy was right or was wrong. And once it's reached the courts, it sort of left public debate.
Yes.
So it was then sitting at the court, and people were then saying, well, we have to wait and see what court will tell us, what the judges will tell us. And I see that as a very, very problematic development.
I'm sure you're right. And judges can be very fine people, but they're not experts in so many things, and why they therefore are the ones to make decisions on what basically are policy matters. Strikes me as will lead to bad policy, bad decisions. People are going to get hurt out of it.
Yes, I mean, you had the same thing in immigration. So saying whether certain immigration policies were justified or not, and these are issues which should be decided within society. You need to come to some kind of arrangement and some kind of conclusion. And otherwise, you have an open, an unsettled issue which sort of carries on and on and on and is never resolved.
I'm speaking to Sabine Beppler-Spahl, who's the chair of the liberal think tank, Freiblickinstitut, or Free Vision Institute, and in Germany, speaking to me today from Berlin. Can I ask about COVID? You mentioned it. We here in Australia had very draconian laws, which caused a lot of controversy, and even to demonstrate against vaccine mandates, that is, against vaccines being compulsory, whether has led to the demonising of the protesters. I mean, they're a mixed lot, I know, and all kinds of strange ideas go around. But we've even found in Australia, I think, a less tolerance for free discussion and debate during COVID as well. I guess it's the fear of the disease causes you to shut down freedom. Yes.
I mean, fear is always a very bad advisor, and we had the same here. So you saw how fear was this very powerful limitation to all kinds of debates. So we had massive limitations on debates, on free movement. We had demonstrations banned.
Demonstrations
Yes, we
were
have the
banned.
same, and mandatory
Yeah.
vaccines are still on the table. So Germany might well be the only country, or one of the few countries, which will introduce mandatory vaccines. There is a law which is being discussed in Parliament at the moment.
With this law, you
yeah.
mean everyone must get vaccinated? That sort of law?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, and if they don't, there'll be a heavy fine. Austria introduced it, was the first country which introduced it, and was sort of Germany then followed, but it's not off the table. There is resistance. There are a few groups who's even a few liberals within Parliament, staunch liberals, who are speaking out against it, but the majority seems to be in favor. So this is another sort of worrying trend we're seeing in Germany,
Yes.
and something which our institute certainly will protest against.
One of your most recent book, I think, is called Raus der Mitte, Get Out of the Middle. And the subtext is How Party Consensus Undermines Our Democracy. Can you tell us more why you think party consensus is bad for democracy?
Well, actually, I wanted to call the book "The Radical Get Out of the Radical Middle," because there was this nice term which a British sociologist phrased, and they wouldn't let me. But
what would that be in German?
Die radikale Mitte.
Oh, I like that. Raus die radikale Mitte.
Yes, because well, I think we've suffered in the past years tremendously from a huge cross-party consensus, which has also limited debates in a big way, and pushed all oppositions into the outer parliamentarian realm, and strengthened what you might call populism. So you've had a consensus on almost everything, even things which. So an example was the I don't know, that in 2013 there was the massive euro crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and it was a very contentious issue, and there were questions of how to deal with it. Should we have more austerity or less austerity? Should banks be saved? And it was a cross-party consensus, because only very, very few dissidents, brave people, spoke out against it. Again, they brought the issue to the Constitutional Court, and most of these dissidents came from different parties. So it was not like they were from one party, but they were from different parties. But in each case, they were very quickly isolated within their parties, and most of them now are not actually even in active politics anymore. So there was a consensus and a kind of feeling, almost like in a war, we have to stand together, and if we don't all agree on this, there'll be a massive problem. And we had the same thing in COVID, of course.
This may be a naive question. Most of my questions probably are, actually, but isn't the fact also you've got a system of government which almost invariably requires coalitions?
Yes.
And therefore you don't have a clear government party and opposition party. Have I understood that correctly? Well,
we don't have the same system as in Britain, where you have the first past the post system. So you have, you need majority, so you need to form coalitions.
We've got that. We've got preferential, where you have your second and third vote counted as you go down. So the winning party ought to have, if not people's first vote, they voted more for it than they did for the opposition. But that's not your system.
We have two. Yes, we have first and second votes, but we have the second vote is the vote which counts, which is then the vote for the strongest party. And we've had an interesting trend in these last years that we don't have a classic party system anymore as in the past. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I come from a social democratic party, and I remember politics was always divided between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, and it was, and that was it. And you were somewhere found yourself in one of these parties, and that's not the case anymore at all. So we don't have what the Germans used to call Volksparteien, People's Party. That was actually the word, because they gathered so much support. And we don't have that anymore. So the classic big parties, both of them have lost massive votes in the last years, have lost membership, have been. So at the moment, we have a completely new situation, which I don't think Germany, no, which I know Germany's never had in the post-war period, which is a coalition of three parties, the strongest party being the Social Democrats, but actually leading this coalition on a very, very weak basis with only a minute advantage towards the other parties and nowhere near a majority. So only about having the support of only about 23% of the population, which of course makes it a very, very weak government, always having to negotiate, always having to agree on their politics, and being pretty much in parliament because they say, well, it's our turn now, we'd also like to govern, but there's very little they actually agree on. It's basically a coalition of necessity, you would say.
And this is not led to good government or good freedom, you're saying?
Well, it's certainly, again, it's sort of limiting. And so the interesting thing is that we have the Green Party as one of the coalition members, which is sort of represents the kind of liberal left, greenish, we call them liberals, strand of liberalism, identitarian liberalism. But we also have the Liberal Party, which was traditionally the more kind of economic liberals and had a bit of a sort of individual liberal political concept to it. And originally, the idea was that these two parties, the Green Party and the Liberal Party, were actually complete opposites. They were both liberal, but on this whole long spectrum of liberalism. But now you see that actually they do agree. They have much more in common than people might have thought. So both of them represent an elite in Germany. Both of them represent the better off, and they therefore also generate their politics alongside this elite. They focus a lot on minority rights. They're against anything to do with they love supranational politics. They love the EU, for example. They're in this business of taking decisions away from the people, both of them. So that's a very kind of strong impetus and gives people who don't like that kind of politics very little to do anything against, to do anything about. What can you do if you're a liberal and you don't agree with that kind of political trend? The only thing you can do is go into the opposition and say you want to found your own groups. You want to do something different.
So perhaps the breakdown of the big parties has not been a good thing at all. I raise this because people often think that we'd have a more free society if big parties weren't there. We had a lot of independents voting on things. But are you suggesting that there's actually a downside when strong parties break down and you're forced into endless compromises and so forth? Is that a conclusion you can draw from the present situation?
I mean, if the big parties do represent people's desires and wishes, then I think yes. Then I think the big parties do have something to speak for them. So you'd say. They might not. They do represent. People find their own wishes within that big party, which was what happened in the past. You said I don't agree fully with the Social Democrats, but all in all, they do represent what I would. They're going in the right direction. On the other hand, I do think that the idea of having different parties is very positive. So I don't know if the first past the post policy as you have it in Britain is better, because you're always excluding. You have what you might call a party dictatorship,
Yes.
parties sharing power amongst themselves, with very little scope for new parties being able to push into that system.
Yes,
so I think
I see your point.
I think having a coalition system isn't a bad thing, as long as parties stick to their policies and really represent the people who they're meant to represent.
And provide genuine diversity of viewpoint rather than a progressive consensus, which sounds like you've got in your so-called liberal parties in Germany.
Yes.
I was thinking one argument against my point of view that large parties are good for freedom is the massive confusion of the Israeli system, its compromises and challenges. There's everything going on there. Can I, as we come to an end, yes, can I ask on this final thing before I talk about a foreign affair matter? It's probably very hard to tell, but are you optimistic about liberalism in Germany? Real liberalism, I mean, not the name, but the real liberalism in Germany.
Yes, I think I am optimistic about it. I think that we have a younger generation which has grown up, and we have. I think debating culture, despite all the problems which I've mentioned, is still alive and well. I think we have to keep an eye on it. We have to make sure that that we are going the right. We're getting it right this time in German history.
Yes.
We're quite lucky because we have these. We do have a number of people who have experienced a completely different system, as you said at the beginning. So we still have a bit of a divide between East and West, and strangely, it is often the people in the East who are protesting. Who are saying we don't like this kind of we don't like cancel culture. We don't like people telling us what to think. We don't like the one-dimensional news we're getting often, this kind of only one interpretation of the truth. And I think that's quite a good chance Germany has, that we have this. We also, I was also heartened. I have two children. They're not actually teenagers anymore. Time goes by so fast. They've just become 20. But they voted for the first time in the last elections. And I was very, very surprised. Both of them voted for the Liberal Party because they told me they wanted to support freedom rights. And I thought they were oddballs because they're my kids. But then I realized that their generation, the first-time voters, that was the strongest party, which first-time voters voted for was the Liberal Party. And I'm not exactly sure why. Obviously, I haven't spoken to every one of these young kids, but you do see that that's surprising with all the kind of green issue, the climate debate, and everything with going on. You would have thought they might have voted for the Green Party, but they voted. The Liberal Party was the strongest party with young people. So that's a good thing, So
you said the Liberal Party was a kind of not entirely Liberal Party.
Yes, that's true. But we also have to remember that there's very little choice for young people.
Yes.
And from all the kind of parties they might have chosen from, it's probably not the worst choice. At least it answers the question of whether I'm hopeful. And I say, well, it's not the worst thing that could have happened.
At the time of our speaking, the situation in Ukraine is unclear where it's going to go. It's certainly developing. But many people were surprised, some very pleasantly, some I assume not as pleasantly, at the remarkable change in German foreign policy and defence policy that occurred in late February this year. You're there on the ground. What do you make of it? And what does it mean for liberalism, if anything?
Well, I would say for the moment, nothing really positive for liberalism. Germany reacted because it was under massive pressure, and there were very close ties, especially between the Social Democratic Party and the Russian government, which Germany was criticized for. And so by invading the Ukraine, Russia crossed the famous red line, and Germany had to react. But as giving more money for military might be necessary, because we've had these talks about how terrible and what terrible situation the German army is in. But it doesn't mean that this money is necessarily well invested. So we have spent a lot of money in the past years on external consultants. And there's actually been a parliamentary inquiry into this. So all this money gone. Where is this money which taxpayers have paid for the military? And now we're hearing that Germany is not able to defend itself. So it's also a question of policy. And there's another kind of very contentious issue in Germany. And I might be one of the few people who's saying this, but I think in the past we had mandatory military service with a right to for conscientious objection, and And actually, it was scrapped. It was gotten rid of in the past years, and people thought this was a very, very good progressive move. But the problem is, of course, that by doing that, the military has become far less democratic. You have far less democratic control over the German military. People don't really know what's happening in the military anymore. And there might be an idea to kind of reintroduce that, including women, though, saying to young people that military is not something which should float above society. We should all know what's happening. We should all decide whether we want foreign missions, where we want money for the military to go. We see that something has to happen. We know that the world isn't as peaceful as we might have thought it was. It is a serious situation we're having at the moment in Europe, but we have to control our own government and our own military, and we have to know where we're going in this.
So rather ironically, something which looks illiberal, conscription, you think may actually mean, strangely enough, a freer engagement with the society, with the military. That's a very interesting point of view.
Yes.
Interesting. Germany's often sat in the middle of Europe and balancing between East and West, the Russians and the West, the Americans, you might say. In fact, I read a piece by Joseph Joff in early March in the Wall Street Journal, where he, by the way, remembers that von Bismarck once counselled to never cut the link to St. Petersburg. So there's always been this two-way. Do you think Germany will hold out? It's this reaction, surprising reaction, which has got strong support, consensus, except for the extreme parties. It's all right, relatively early on, but the Germans got the strength of character to put up with more expensive prices, less available gas for the next year or 2 years as this matter continues on? Or do you think they will not sustain it any further? Because it is a very big change of policy, which is going to cost Germany as well as others in keeping the policy.
Yes. I think the main problem is the dependency on Russian gas. So Germany made this very foolish decision to move entirely towards alternative energies in the past years. And the last atomic power stations have been switched off or are being switched off this year, meaning that Germany really has no choice and has also tried to become a leader in anti-global warming policy, meaning that the coal power stations will also be switched off. So there was the famous joke Putin made a couple of years ago saying, well, it's all very nice, and I understand that Germans are afraid of atomic power, but how do they want to heat their flats in winter? Do they want to use firewood? So that's an absolute point. And I think Germany is completely dependent on cheap gas. It doesn't even have harbors for liquid gas. So these things make me very skeptical as to how far we can hold out.
Dear.
We're moving into summer now, which is good. Winter will come, and winters can be quite hard in Germany.
Yes. Well, I hate to say this on my podcast, but on that point, Putin was right.
Yes.
I must say, it was with incredulity I heard about the closing down of the nuclear because, anyway, once you've got paid the capital costs, it's a very good form of low emissions power, but there you are. Can I reassure you, Sabine, your worry about spending money and wasting it on defence, that's a strong tradition here in Australia.
Okay.
Just to reassure you that you're not alone. Overuse of consultants rather than government make decisions. Again, we are as one on this matter as well, I'm afraid. Which means the tasks of your think tank and our think tank is very much needed.
Well,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being my guest today. I've been speaking to Sabine Beppler-Spahl, the chair of the German liberal think tank, the Freiblickinstitut from Berlin, and talking about some of the challenges and issues of liberalism in that great country of Germany. This has been another podcast from the Centre for Independent Studies. For decades, the CIS has been an independent voice working to deliver evidence-based policy within a classical liberal framework. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. Head to cis.org.au to see how you can get involved. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for listening. I'm Rob Forsyth. You're listening to Liberalism in Question.